Okay, I know I'm bad at this. What I was talking before about the blue material in the bottom, we're on the talking about the relationship between the synoptic gospels, between Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Notice John is not even here. So we're talking about Q, quella, which means the source material for this double tradition stuff. The stuff that Luke and Matthew have, it's hypothetical. In other words, no one has seen such a source in its literary composition. So we're extrapolating that this source exists. Then, on top of that, we add in the other two sources for Luke and Matthew, the material unique to Luke and the material unique to Matthew. So let me explain how I think this works. And the way I'm going to do that is to hopefully insert a slide. So how does this work? So scholars will say that the synoptic gospels are equal to Mark plus Q, and that is called the two-source theory. And how that works is that the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those three gospels are comprised of Mark plus Q, two sources, and then all of the other material that Luke and Matthew put in is unique to them. It's not embedded in another source. Okay, so that's two source. So the four-source theory. The four-source theory was Mark plus Q plus unique material unique to Luke plus material unique to Matthew. I put the U in there because unique, so you'll have the word unique in mind. But usually when scholars do this, they eliminate the U, so it's just L and M. And what this ends up doing is the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are comprised of the two major sources, Mark and Q, plus L and M, and this is called the four-source theory. But you can see that if you use the four-source theory, it accords very little creativity to the gospel writers. In other words, the gospel writers then genuinely become mere editors of material, not really purveyors of any kind of unique material. And so I want to point this out, that within the way that these systems work, and so you have either the two source or the four source. So I'd be comfortable with either one. I think I'm best under the two-source theory. I think I could live with Luke and Matthew both having their own creativity in the process that may or may not be a source that they have in front of them. But I do accord them that kind of creativity to be able to generate that on their own. So what's the relevance of this, and how does this work? This is one way to explain the synoptic problem. So the synoptic problem is the relationship between these gospels. The relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But there are other ways to explain it. And another way to explain it is to say that Mark was first, and then either Matthew or Luke was second, and that the other edited the partner gospel. So this would mean that if Matthew was written first, then Matthew was used by Luke. So it was Matthew plus Mark equals Luke, and then Luke. Let's see if I can put it like that. Matthew equals Mark, and then Luke equals Mark plus Matthew. And so with this in mind, that gives you the impression that you don't need a Q, that you just have the author editing his source based on what is important. This allows a lot of creativity to Matthew, and then Luke is the one who edits him out. But there are certain things that you know, this is by far the most likely version of this, the Matthean priority. So Matthew uses Mark, but then Luke uses Mark plus Matthew. But there are some difficulties with this way of thinking, and the major difficulty has to do with what the other knew and what the other doesn't preserve. Now, it works for Luke, I think, a little bit better. This arrangement works better. If you flip this and you have Luke written first, it's hard to imagine Matthew writing, seeing the Good Samaritan, seeing those parables, seeing that block material, and then editing it out. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine Luke having Matthew and not including the Sermon on the Mount as a block. You could already see that Luke prefers to block his material. How do you not block that part of Matthew in? Those are just a few of the weaknesses that the four-source theory presents. The four-source theory is attractive. It does recognize the data, and this data remains important. It's the data that drives everything else. And so my own opinion about it is that Mark was written first. That's my own opinion, and I do think there was a Q. Beyond that, I will take the two-source theory at the moment. I have not done near enough work on the materials that are unique to Luke or unique to Matthew in order to try to ascribe to them some kind of a separate provenance that could be used. But this synoptic problem, the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is what we're talking about here. And the easiest way to, I think the easiest way to explain it is that Mark was written first, that Matthew and Luke independently used Q to produce their own stories for their own communities. And that allows Matthew his Jewish kind of audience and Luke his Gentile kind of audience, so that Luke can transition to the book of Acts, and Matthew basically is a standalone. One thing that is interesting about this is when you look at the apocryphal Gospels, there are so many that use Matthew as a source material source material, and it kind of makes me wonder if that this Matthew having Mark and then Luke editing Matthew might be an attractive option for those who are skittish with Q. So that's the four-source theory. And that complements the look into Gospels that we've been able to take. Mark, Gentile Gospel, short, sweet, rugged Greek, and a passion story with an extended introduction. Matthew, a Jewish Gospel. Jesus' Jewish identity is highlighted. His identification with Moses, the genealogy identifying him as the one who fulfills the kingdom of David, and not a little of which relates to the interaction between Jesus and the Jewish authorities. And then Luke's Gospel, which opens itself up to Gentile interests and universal possibilities and women's concerns and the concern for the poor. Very unique, and it opens you to see the different theological emphases that the Gospel writers thought were important to them and to their communities. Now, this isn't meant to be an in-depth portrait. This is a really rudimentary portrait, but it does help you get to that sense in which you understand how the three Gospels relate one to the other. And notice we haven't even said a word about John. That will come later. But we present this here, and so the picture of Jesus that emerges is a composite picture. We need all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to tell the story of who Jesus is. Each of these Gospels, the communities that that represent, these are all important features. And so I hope that has been helpful to you. Again, make a comment. Let me know what you're learning, and or a question, so that I can type an answer to you and reply. All right, thanks. And the next time we come back, we will be talking about John's Gospel.